Procedural terrain sculpting is an entirely different approach than sculpting with standard terrains. And it has quite a few limitations and some issues in the current version. You can load in this scene, and it's called Rocky Terrain _var, and here's a render of it at the current position, just to give you an idea of the material distribution overall for the terrain with the current setup. It's using a fairly basic material for the most part. It's a mixed material comprised of two mixed materials. Each individual material as part of the main mix is distributed using the output of the roughness setting from a terrain fractal. The terrain fractal uses not a super complex setup, but I am controlling primarily the gain, smooth areas, and distortion using another fractal. That way you can get some of the distortion to conform to the elevation. So it's not a really complex terrain. We're going to go back into the terrain editor, open that up, and now the sculpting works a little differently with the procedural terrain. And I'm going to start by just sculpting out this area, one of the ridges. I can hold down Shift, double click, and then zoom in. And I just want to pull this area out and push down. So I'm going to decrease the brush size, and I'm going to be starting with the Sculpt tool so that we kind of stick to the same direction of the normal. Just find a good spot to start with. And first I'm going to just push it down. And I'm going to reduce my flow a little. And then I'm going to go ahead and dig in on the bottom and then pull out the top slightly. Now I haven't made a huge change, but because I've initialized the displacement geometry, what's going to happen is we're going to lose a lot of detail. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a preview render. And even in the higher level modes of render settings, this issue is still going to show up. And what we can see are large polygonal blocks on this peak. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on the area that I sculpted. And by looking at this, the material distribution is getting messed up from it. Shadows are being incorrectly calculated, and the overall diffusion, certain highlights are having issues. Basically what we've done is reduced the procedural terrain down to a lower resolution, and almost a fixed resolution based on the total displacement geometry amount, which right now is only 131,000 polygons, and that is very minimal for a procedural terrain. If we take a look at the wireframe, you can see that this wouldn't be nearly enough geometry to generate procedural terrain. And even if we output the altitude and connect it to the bump of the material, it would be very difficult to be able to work with this resolution. And the whole point of a procedural terrain is to have an infinite amount of polygons. So depending on the camera's position, the closer we zoom in, the more that should increase. So because of this, and we're basically doing that to the entire terrain, Even in the areas that haven't been sculpted, they won't look as good. So what I'm going to do is just hit reset, which is going to just reset the sculpted geometry. We can see the terrain is back to where it was. And we still have the procedural. And because I didn't modify the 2D layer and sort of the additional displacement, which is what we'd be controlling if we used any of the erosion effects or global effects, or if we use any of the 2D tools. So we need to come up with a new approach if it's going to be a procedural terrain that we're sculpting. And basically, what we can do is use a zone. So we're going to click View Zones, which allows us to see the scene. And you can also see my two sunlights. That's because I have one with a shadow map and one with ray tracing. And what I want to do is draw in an area to sculpt in. So we can click Add and just draw out. Using a square zone is going to work typically the best. And that's because of the fading options that are available. And the important thing about using a zone, well, there's a couple of important notes. But the advantage is that what we can do is sculpt out our terrain, and instead of triggering a geometry change for the entire terrain, it is limited to the sculpted zone. So every single zone is going to have its own defined displacement geometry. So I'm just going to create a slight change in the terrain, not doing a whole lot, smoothing out some of those areas, and I'm going to go ahead and just do a freeform. And now you may notice, if you're using this method, that the flow amount becomes very minimal, and in fact you don't get nearly enough pressure. So if you're using a pressure-sensitive tablet, there's nothing wrong with your tablet. You are pressing hard enough. It's just the limited flow. The only way to get around that is to create a filter with a curve. Not always suggested. If you're not using the inflate tool, then it shouldn't be too large of an issue, but this will allow you to create a much more dramatic effect and use a higher flow. But you do have to be careful with using curves in your filters. So now if we go over to the zones and view the entire terrain zone, we can see that number to define the displacement geometry is gone, because we don't have that effect on this terrain level unless we choose to initiate a 3D sculpt or displace the geometry, which in fact will also displace all of the other zones. So let's take a look with this additional sculpt. And this certainly looks much better than it did. There is a little bit of distortion in the shadow map. That might also be the ray trace, but it does look like maybe it's even in fact affecting both because it's part of the diffusion of the material. But it's not as bad as it was. And by continuing to sculpt in that area, we can increase the resolution and not worry about losing the detail on the rest of the terrain. Now, what you will notice, in the OpenGL you will see the zone tear if you've sculpted around the edges. So a very important thing when you're sculpting with zones is to try to stay away from the edge. because what will happen is a displacement between the primary terrain and the zone, and then you'll have to use fading. Now fading does work pretty well, but if you have a bunch of zones, several zones, the blend between the fades on all the different zones could cause issues. So I'm going to continue to manipulate the terrain to make it a little more interesting, add some more detail. And so I've just kind of pulled out this area over here, and I don't really have a whole lot of detail on the top, so I can pull that down and push some of those areas in, and then I've just got kind of a little bit of a ridge over here just around the back. Go ahead and click OK. Now we're going to see a lot more render errors because we've manipulated the terrain far more than it was previously. But because I did stay away from the edges, shouldn't really notice any problems between the transition. So I'm just going to reposition the camera over here, and we'll take a look at just a quick render. Okay, so a lot of problems. Huge tear, and a lot of lighting shadow issues. I'm going to change the lighting just because it's a little difficult to tell exactly what it is we're looking at with the current lighting. So I'm going to manipulate, just change some of those settings. Now, even though we didn't really see the tear, it is showing up, and I'm going to change the camera angle and see if that disappears, because sometimes the camera angle will make a big difference. It can also change distributions of materials. So in fact, the tear is not caused by the camera angle, at least not with the change I made. One problem was, or is, the way I sculpted. Extreme sculpting like this is not always necessary. As you can see, I've brought down a very large section at the top. Well, that didn't necessarily have to be sculpted or displaced in order to achieve that. So it's really a matter of determining whether or not you really need to sculpt an area. Another thing to pay attention to is the smoothing. Excessive smoothing of an area with the sculpting tools can cause issues. Now, we're going to take a look at some of the blending options. So we have, going to the zones, go ahead and select the zone. We can activate fading. Another big thing, if we take a look at the wireframe, a lot of stretched areas. Even though we have a lot of geometry here, it's still going to cause a problem. So what I want to do is turn on the fading, and this is one of the main reasons why a square terrain is going to work the best, because the geometry and the way it's divided, typically working with a square is going to be a little bit easier. There are a lot of different fading types. I'm going to choose the Gaussian and just turn down the size a little, click OK. And what this is going to do is trigger the subdivision of the surface and the blending between the different elevations of the zone and the entire terrain. So we were able to remove the tear by using the fade, but the lighting is still just awful, and the shadows primarily are being a little strange. And like I said, I am using both the shadow and ray trace map, or shadow map and ray tracing on two separate lights. and they will both show problems and have some overall errors, just different ones. If we go back into the object and take a look, clearly, since we see all of this stretching, that is a problem. So when you're sculpting, you want to try to avoid that kind of manipulation to the procedural, because we're not just giving us more space to map the procedural to, we're displacing the procedural itself, and very extreme amounts of manipulation in directions in which the procedural travels, which is upward. It's going to cause some problems. So have a good idea of ahead of time what you want, and use outside in the main zone, you can manipulate upwards or modify the procedural itself. But mainly, especially when you're working with procedurals, you want to use sculpting primarily just to pull areas off, to create overlaps, kind of digging out caves. I wouldn't rely on it as a primary source of creating a 3D object, because you won't really be able to do anything with it if there's a problem. So in this case, if we can't correct that render error, and one thing I am going to do is just pull up this area on the side, so further extending the horrible destruction of this terrain. But I'm also going to subdivide, so we can just scale down the brush, take a look at the wireframe, and this is when it gets worse. You really want to make sure that you're never subdividing more than one step at a time. And I'm also going to try to make it equal. What we're going to see is a lot of polygonal errors within the terrain editor, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to show up in the render. What it's actually doing is using the height generated 2D map from the original or the entire terrain zone, and using that to displace. Because it is a procedural, it is calculated a little differently, so you might not have to worry about what you're seeing in the terrain editor actually showing up as part of the render. So a lot of pixel blocks. I'm going to go ahead and click OK, and we'll take a look at this. And most of those typically don't show in the render, so this is still kind of rendering out, but we can see there's a new tear. And the material distribution looks terrible. So the extent of which you can really do zone sculpting, regular sculpting with the procedural terrain can be minimal, at least at the moment, because there's really no way for us to use that geometry elsewhere, and that's the big problem with this method. I'm not saying it should never be used or that it's completely broken, because I have been able to work on a few things using this method without running into problems. But it really is going to depend on the way you sculpt and how much geometry you have. So because this geometry, I've doubled it, and we now have 524,000 polygons to define this. The calculation to blend the geometry using the fade mode is not quite going to work at this low of a level. So what I'm going to do is increase the fading amount, which will sometimes fix this error. But back to what I was saying about not really being able to use this information elsewhere. What I mean by that is that the sculpt can't be converted. So typically a solution would be, oh well, convert it to a standard terrain, use some bump mapping to kind of mimic the elevation or bring it back to a procedural. The problem with that is the 3D sculpt, when it's on a zone, is independent to the zone. If you convert the terrain, you lose that information. So at the moment, it's completely confined to it. And I've actually just gone ahead and made this far worse than it was before. One trick you can do, if we edit the terrain, is to turn off the fading on the zone. And go to the entire terrain zone, and you can turn on fading. I'm going to reduce this. Sometimes you can pull it down quite a ways. If this doesn't work, then you can run the fade on both the entire terrain zone and the sculpted zone. And it is getting slightly better. However, it still has a huge hole in it. So now let's use fading with both. So we can turn it on. Both the entire terrain and the zone that was drawn out. I'm going to go ahead and take fading, increase the size amount all the way for the entire terrain zone. And in this case, there's really no change. So when you're working with the zone, there's a couple of things to pay attention to. Now, first of all, one thing I've done is created the zone in the center of one of the primary quadrants, and in between two zones. So if we take the terrain, you can really divide it, just continually divide it, basically the way that the 3D geometry is divided. So we have 4 main sections. Typically you want to avoid being in more than one of these sections at a time. That's when you run into problems. So if this was offset slightly and in a different area, you probably wouldn't have these issues. Another thing is that I have the geometry at the moment too high for this method. I'm going to delete that. Now that 3D information is gone. So like I was saying, it's connected completely to the zone. Converting this to a standard terrain would also delete that information. So we can take a look at the grid, and if you need a better preview while you're working in the zone mode and zone preview, you can change your object preview. Take a look underneath the load material in the aspect tab, select wireframe, edit the object, view zone, and you typically do have to zoom in rather close. It looks like it's just going to take a second to refresh. There's been a lot of OpenGL problems with Vue for a very long time regarding the display modes. Basically, if something's hidden, it normally isn't fully hidden and does tend to show up. And that's because of the calculation used to really generate it. Not sure if that's going to be improved at any time, but so this might not be a completely reliable method, but you can see in a way a benefit by moving this around. We can see some of it updating and kind of how Vue generates its geometry. So let's create a new zone, and what I want to do is just kind of draw one over on the side. If you need that specific zone, in this case I wanted to work on that area, I would need to modify the origin of the altitude production and any fractals that are connected to it. One thing you can do is just offset. So if you take the link between position and anything else connected to it, you can add in a math node, vector operations, and offset, and then connect that in And this will allow you to type in an offset amount so you can move around the entire fractal. I'm not going to be doing that for this terrain. It will allow you to move it around. The values are really going to depend on the mapping mode you're using. I'm using object parametric and not world. One thing you could do is convert this over to the world mode and then move the terrain slightly, which will lock in the procedural to that position and then switch it back. I'm just going to stick with object parametric, add a zone, and just draw it out in this section here. So I want to make sure that I'm not dividing the displaced geometry more than the initial creation, which means we're fairly restricted in how much we can sculpt. But like I was saying, it's really a matter of, do you really need to sculpt out certain areas? Because if you're mainly pushing things down, well, that can be done in the 2D layer and would not require a displacement. Another thing is you can keep your zones smaller to work on very specific areas, but for the most part that's really dependent on the features. So I'm just going to do a very small modification and use invert with freeform and just pull in that area. Go ahead and turn down my flow a little. And probably should have avoided the edge a little bit more. So I'm just going to pull in each of these sides really quick. And now what I want to do is just to make a little more modification to the top ridge. I'm just going to use the inflate tool with invert off and just kind of expand that top part. And then if I want to do some finer details on the bottom, just kind of push that in. And then I'm going to just skew the ridge a little. So this would be something that would be basically impossible without sculpting. And that's what you want to use it for. You got to be paying attention to how you're using sculpted geometry or the displacement layer, because sometimes you don't really need to use the sculpting tools to achieve some of these effects. So with a very minimal change, there shouldn't be any large issues. Certainly not like before. And this is just another preview mode render, but we can see no problems overall. Everything looks like it's rendering correctly. There's no tears. And so if you're going to be doing this method with an infinite terrain, any sort of procedural terrain, keep your changes minimal. And if you have to, you're going to need to find another way to achieve some of the effects. And basically, it could be taking a standard terrain and kind of mixing it in with the current procedural. There's also the ability to use the 2D tools that are available in order to manipulate the geometry. So let's take a look at that zone where I have that change. If we go to the entire terrain zone, now the 2D layer that we can manipulate will work independently from that sculpted geometry, so we don't need to worry about that interfering. Because when you make changes to the 2D areas or the 2D layer of a procedural terrain with the sculpt directly on that layer, it can cause problems. So sometimes it's a good idea to plan it out first And I do need to reduce that overall flow. And sometimes undoing will change your camera position. That's one thing to pay attention to. The 2D tools are typically more powerful as far as the flow amount. So if you want to, you can push some of the areas out down first, and then if we wanted, we could pull this top up. And sometimes you just want to conform the 2D area to what you're going to be sculpting, and sometimes you can achieve a better result. Now keep in mind, this is going to modify our zone that we currently have. So it will in fact look different because they're going to be blended together. Any modifications we make to the primary entire terrain zone is going to affect every other defined zone in any zones we create. So if you need to make a modification, try it in the 2D layer first, or at least plan it out in the 2D modification if you're going to be using this method, because it is very useful. You just have to use it minimally. And there still aren't really any issues. By looking at the render, everything looks pretty good, except we may need to activate the fading if there are too many changes to that 2D layer. And we still have fading on for the primary layer all the way. I'm just going to switch it over, turn on fading for that new defined zone. Because we are so close to the edge where we modified it, that's another thing. In this case, I mean, I didn't really plan it out too far ahead of time. I just kind of drew the zone and then decided to paint in it, which was way too close to the corner. It's a good idea to draw them out, kind of stick to the center, which will really help these fading operations. And then if you're still having issues, I like to use the Gaussian mode. It seems to work well, but you can try other modes. Sometimes you can end up with a little bit of a better blend and also fix some errors. And with the fading on, I now see a problem, which is mainly the sculpted part of this zone isn't really showing, and I can also see a tear, which may not show up in the main render around the side, but typically a tear, even in preview mode, indicates that there is going to be a shadow problem. And I can also kind of see a square outline. It's just some weird stuff kind of happening. So I want to show you an alternate method if you're going to be using this kind of a terrain. And what I want to do is just delete that zone. So now we just have the primary terrain and the entire terrain zone. What I want to do is make a copy of this object. Select the procedural terrain, and because I don't want the 2D manipulation that I also created, I'm going to reset, which is going to remove the modifications I made to that ridge where I had just pulled it down and up. So just hitting reset will not affect the procedural or any of your zones, just that 2D modified layer. So we're going to copy and paste it. Now, the material may or may not work correctly, and it may be connected to the other terrain because it does have custom dependencies. I'm not going to worry about that just yet. What I want to do is edit the object, and I'm going to be changing the mapping mode over to world. And I also want to add in the additional nodes to preserve the geometry. Depending on your vector setup, sometimes that doesn't work. But what we can do now is take this copy, scaling the X and Y. I'm going to undo that. And just move this over to the area I want to modify. And this is a world terrain. It does not look like the geometry is updating. If we go ahead to edit the object, we should see it update. So now we have a separate terrain and kind of a custom zone. And this way we could convert over to a standard terrain if needed and blend them together. So I'm going to go ahead and move this out a little, and now it is updating. Now, I've gone ahead and just bumped this up above the procedural, or the original terrain, just to show that it is separated. This is the preview render, so of course it doesn't look great. It doesn't give you a good idea, though. But we can still see that it's connected to that external dependency of the roughness, which is around kind of these squiggly areas and the distribution throughout the terrain. Now, because that's connected to the original procedural, we can manipulate this and even convert it to a standard terrain without losing that rough area output defined within the original procedural. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that really quick. And this is the rough output, which is just connected to the second output. So when you go to connect to the bottom of the terrain fractal, it says, do you want the altitude or the second output? So that is the second output. And if we continue to connect to that object with our materials on the duplicated terrain, then it should preserve all of the current settings. So what I want to do is just move this down back where it was, so that the same height. And if you need to, what I would suggest in this case is to modify the 2D layer of the original procedural terrain. And what we're going to do is just kind of dip it below the copy. So let's view the entire scene. And it is saying that my terrain is twisted even though I did not use any of those scaling settings, so that might just be a little bit of an error. But what I want to do is use the 2D tools, and I'm going to be first just raising up the edge around the intersection. And then inside, what I can do is just lower it. And it doesn't have to be a lot, just enough to get it underneath the other terrain. So being able to preview this in the other mode, or in the view scene mode, is very helpful. So what you can also do is turn that off and just make sure that you haven't completely destroyed this geometry or caused any huge render problems that could result from that. And I accidentally just converted it over to a standard terrain, which there is no undo for. So I'm going to just hit X to cancel that, and then I can go back and just redo it. Hopefully in a future version, the OK and the X button will not be right next to each other. I like to work quickly, and unfortunately it often means that I do hit the X instead of the OK. And since the enter to close out the terrain editor currently doesn't work all the time, that is rather unfortunate. So pay attention. Make sure you hit the OK, because right now it doesn't look like they're going to be moving it anytime soon. while I am going back and redoing this, a couple of techniques to get this to work a little better would be to, just in case you run into a problem where the materials aren't going to blend, not because they have the same material, it really shouldn't be a problem, although we are using different object modes, and because the overall scale is changing, there is a possibility that the material scales will need to be modified to match. Because if we're using object parametric mode on anything, mostly I'm using that just for the distributions. But a good idea is to kind of work with the geometry around the edges and just raise it up where you think you'll be able to kind of hide it behind a feature. If depending on the shadows that you have set, sometimes it's a good idea to work along with the shadows and just try to find a way where you think you can cover up any sort of seam that's going to show. For the most part, it shouldn't show up. Obviously, you're running stills, you can just take care of it in post. Animation, then you have to kind of manipulate that in other ways. Another thing you could do is to create finer details for the blend that might stretch out further, and a good idea sometimes is take a look at a render of the material and kind of work with the bump to get it to conform if you have a high amount of bump or a rockier surface. Now, because of the change between the object scales, the material is off. And also because some of the changes in the elevation by getting them to kind of mix and try to match them. So what I can do at this point is to go back to the original object, and I'm going to, and once again it's saying it's twisted even though it is not, or at least it shouldn't be. But what I want to do is change this over to world mapping mode. Add those extra options. Make sure the scale is set to 1, or at least take note of that scale so you can use it in the materials. If we edit the material, now I was using the object parametric to mix that distribution. Well, because it's world, now all we need to do is just change that over to world standard. Because the individual mixed materials or part of the mixed materials are already world standard, you don't need to worry about losing any object scale. And also just make sure that that scale is set on both terrains and also matches the scale of the terrain for the altitude production. So world standard, because we do in fact have two independent materials when I copied it, because there was a change or a difference between them. So now they're blending much better, and the scales are really quite good. The only issue that we're going to have with matching this is the fact that the elevation is different. Basically, if anything's defined by the height or the altitude of the terrain, any sort of material distribution controlled by height, if the object height changes, it's going to manipulate that setting. It becomes more difficult when you're working with a mixed material, because if you're using the influence of environment like I am, the influence of the altitude makes a big difference. And if the object scale changes, then it is more difficult to work with that. Another solution, besides fine-tuning it and tweaking it until you can get it to be the same, is just to apply the material. Find out which one. I'm going to go ahead and edit this, or actually we might be able to just refresh it, then get that to show up. It looks like that's not working. So I'm going to edit the material and just change the name to mountain. as the main, and now we can drag that onto the other object. So if they both have the same material, then in fact it should work because everything is set to world. And now everything's blended really well. The only thing I would need to do is maybe fine-tune the seam to get it to match up a little bit better. Maybe reduce the elevation amounts that I had, or even go into the copy and kind of mix them. Because the only problem is if you stick with the exact same height, you will tend to notice a seam showing up. Like I said, if it's a still, then you don't even need to worry about raising the original terrain with that 2D elevation. But for animation, you're going to run into some problems having that seam show up. Because it could flicker in and out and manipulate shadows over time. So now if we wanted to do a more extreme sculpt, we would have that option on this individual, this new terrain. Or since the standard terrain seems to be the best right now for sculpting, the most reliable, then what you can do is increase your terrain resolution a bit. In order to save the geometry from the procedural, you can then convert it over to a standard terrain and make modifications as a standard terrain. Even switch it back to a procedural and rerun the function over it, although it will change the altitude, so you will need to pay attention to extreme modifications. This sort of scene breakdown or terrain breakdown does also make it easier to manage some of the UV changes when you have displaced geometry. So hopefully in future releases there'll be more you can do with the zones, being able to kind of convert them over, hopefully something like that. And at that point, then figure out the best way to use them, and make sure I let everybody know. Unfortunately, for production, reliability is really important, and at the moment, procedural terrain with a massive amount of sculpting is not necessarily going to be the most reliable way to create a scene. But those tools are still very helpful for planning things out, and in other ways they are still going to be overall very useful. You just want to avoid it as your final output for the scene. So taking some time to plan it out can really help you get to where you need to end up. And I do want to show you another thing you could do to blend these terrains, really depending on how you want to sculpt. This would work well for a peak or a high point area. I'm going to reset the 2D modifications I made. We should have a better blend, almost an exact match. It looks like because I didn't use the undo command, I did kind of manually move the other terrain. They might not be matching perfectly. So I wouldn't suggest moving it without keeping in mind the undo. Another thing you could do is even, instead of having your own copied procedural, is to run the external dependency from one object to the other. The only problem is sometimes that just doesn't work out very well. So another option would be to use clipping. And you can achieve some pretty neat effects with this. So we could cut out the bottom portion of a terrain. Now, this doesn't really give me a lot to work with. So this is more specific to this terrain, not really being the best method. But now if we wanted to modify these higher peak areas, we don't have to worry about the other geometry. It's kind of a neat way to bulge out an area, and what you could do is use displaced geometry to kind of tuck in that bottom edge. So let's just really quick do that on here. And this would be just kind of for like rock overhangs. That could work out pretty well. And I did kind of destroy this geometry, but that's alright. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of tuck in the bottom portion around the clipping plane on the bottom. And I just kind of move that around. I'm not really paying attention to the geometry, which is why it's all messed up. So we'll go ahead and just smooth that out. You can see it's very ridged. There's a lot of errors, and that's because of the scale at which I'm smoothing. And I'm going to go back, inflate that a little more. So that's a little interesting looking. We'll go ahead and we can see that. This is one problem that can show up, however, which is because of the displacement and where it was originally positioned. When we clip out the terrain, you can see the displacement layer not quite being cut out all the way. But if we look at a render, you can see that it's just the OpenGL, so not that big of an issue. You could clip it up a little bit higher afterwards if needed, but that is a way to kind of sculpt out just a peak if you were going to work on an area like that. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete that. And feel free to reverse engineer this terrain I've created. It's kind of a neat technique I used for the distortion and manipulation of the terrain fractal. Might be worth taking a look at, and also the lighting. I do want to note there are a few tears that you might notice on the terrain, or a couple of clipped out areas, and that just has to do with some of the extreme values I was using. So it may not be the best reference, but it might give you a couple ideas if you go ahead and take a look at it. And that's the rocky terrain variation scene file.